All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our first set of notes on this new section. Uh, this whole section is about evolution, but today, let me get this working. I wanted to talk about not specifically evolution, but the things that would cause evolution. I want to talk about natural selection. I want to talk about other mechanisms, things that I'm not sure if we would have done the keystone finish line work before or after this video. I'm kind of making them out of order here. So if we already did the keystone work, it's the stuff we read in there. If not, don't worry about it. We're going to get there. But we are going to be talking about things that cause evolution. Before we do that, though, we need to know what evolution actually is. So evolution is the change in allele frequency over time. Right? So you need to know what an allele frequency is. That's easy. How common the alleles are in the population. All right. I mean, right now, go out into Philadelphia. That's our population, the population of the city of Philadelphia. All of the people in that group. How often do you see certain traits? How often do you see brown eyes? 50% of the time, 70% of the time, 80% of the time, whatever. That's an allele frequency. Right? Evolution is when that number changes. Maybe you only saw blue eyes 20% of the time. Now you see it 30% of the time. Now you see it 40% of the time. That's evolution happening. Right? The genes of the entire group are changing. That's evolution. It's not about an individual changing. That's a different word. That's called metamorphosis. Evolution is a population change. Natural selection, the process in which alleles that give an advantage are more likely to be passed on. Meaning if blue eyes are increasing, you only saw them 20% of the time, now you see them 40% of the time, next time you'll see them like 60% of the time. Right? That means those blue eyes must have had some kind of advantage, whether it helps you survive or it helps you get a date, something. Right? It's a good, if it's increasing, it means it's a good thing for some reason. Natural selection is when the good things help you pass on those good things. I have blue eyes. I don't go with it. I have blue eyes. That helped me get a date, and now I passed on my blue eyes to my kid. Now my kid has blue eyes. All right, we got some fundamental principles of natural selection now. These things that are required for natural selection to work. First one is variation, then over reproduction, then passing on genes, and then the actual change. So let's talk about those. Variation, differences in the species, whether you have a higher likelihood of fit traits, right? Meaning your parents have, let's say, six kids, right? So you have 5 siblings. You're not all exactly identical. Some of you are going to look different than others. So you have different traits. In your environment, one of you are bound to be more fit than the others. All right? There's 6 of you, at least one of you has better traits. So that one of you is going to be more likely to pass on those genes. That's variation, being different. Here is a species of caterpillar that I invented. I call them the rainbow caterpillar. They're all the same species, but they come in different colors. They can all reproduce with each other. They all live together. They're the same group. However, they're not, because they're all different, the traits are different. They're going to work differently in the environment. The second thing that's required is over reproduction, meaning if you have enough resources, there's really not going to be that much change, right? If you have enough food, if you have enough shelter, if you have enough to go around, then no one's going to die, all right? Remember, it's change. We have to get rid of the bad traits. The only way to get rid of the bad traits is to kill them. So if you don't over reproduce, there's no competition, no one dies. Over reproduction will force competition. Maybe there's 5 animals on my screen. Maybe there's only enough food for 3 of them. So who doesn't get the food? Whoever has traits that prevent them from getting the food. Whoever traits aren't good enough, that's who. then they don't pass on their genes and the bad traits are gone. So, like I said, forces competition and the less fit die out. All right. So they had competition. You see what just happened there? They had competition for hiding spots, the ability to hide from predators. Turns out the green one blended in with the grass or the leaves better. He didn't get seen. So the birds ate the ones that stood out. That was competition due to overreproduction. There was a lot of them sticking out. So the green ones, the birds didn't go even bother trying to find the green ones. They went for the easier ones. And then passing on genes. The ones who survive get to reproduce. And now the whole group looks like the survivors. They have fit traits. In this case, the fit trait is blending in. And then change. Now the population is different. They used to have all these different colors, and now they don't. That is a change that took place over a long period of time, over many generations of reproducing, but now the whole group is different than they used to be. That all happened. That's what natural selection is. The good traits survive, the bad traits do not. The good traits reproduce, the bad traits do not. That change, that final change at the end, is what we call evolution. All right. So before we go on, we have to understand this. This is called a bell curve, a normal distribution graph. I like prefer bell curve. It's easier to say. This is a healthy graph. A healthy environment with a healthy species will always show a graph that looks like this when you're measuring the traits. Right? This graph is showing us not size. People always think it means, oh, they're getting bigger and now they're getting smaller over time. No, size is down here. Yeah, 4 feet long, 5 feet long, 6 feet long. It turns out these rainbow caterpillars are really big. And this graph shows us is there's not too many of them that are 4 foot long. It's very rare that you come across a 4 foot long caterpillar. Turns out with this species, we actually get a lot more of them that are 4.5 feet long, even more that are 5 foot long. Let's speed that up there. All right. So not too many that are going to be 5.5 and even less that are 6 foot. That's what this graph shows us. How many animals, how many caterpillars have this feature, have this trait. So in this case, for whatever reason, being 5 foot long is the better, more survivable trait. Being too short is bad, being too big is bad. I guess they can't win fights and these guys can't hide. So 5 foot is the best of both worlds. Natural selection is going to actually cause different kinds of changes in this graph. Remember, it's all about change. What you were looking at here, this dotted line, is what it used to look like. And then over here is what it now looks like. It changed over time. So this is what we call directional selection. The organisms on one side of the curve are more fit. Yeah, it seemed like being 5 foot long was great, but it turned out being 6 foot long was even better. So over the course of generations, 6 foot became the normal. And now we got some 7 foot ones. The 4 foot ones that outright disappeared. They were terrible. Right? The whole curve is going to move toward the fitter side. Let me show you what I mean by this. These are some birds. Darwin, if you remember, studied these guys. They're called finches. And he studied beak length on them. So here we got some of them. Here's a zoomed in picture so we know what we're looking at. Some of them have really small beaks. A lot of them have the medium-sized beak. And then only a few have the large-sized beak. Turns out they survive by eating nuts. They need their beaks to break open the shells. So these little guys aren't doing too well because their tiny little beak can't break open the shells too well. But these bigger guys, they're doing really well for themselves. They break open that shell very quickly. They get the food very quickly. And now they have all the time and energy to reproduce and mate. So over time, maybe a few generations, a few years, a few decades, a few centuries later, depends on how fast they reproduce, then we see The small beak ones just went extinct. They're gone. They couldn't survive. They couldn't keep up. There was no food. Everyone else ate it faster. It took them too long. The medium ones started dying out as well. They decreased because the bigger beak ones were eating up all the food way too fast, and these guys couldn't keep up. So a lot of them starved to death. And variation will always, show itself. So now we started seeing some extra large beaks, and they're going to do great. So if you come across a few centuries later, this bell graph would have moved even further. This is what we call directional selection. And this example here is just what I showed you, so we don't really need to read that. If you want to, you can pause it. But this can and will probably result in a new species. Went from the medium-sized species to the extra large-sized species. Eventually, it could become something like a toucan from Fruit Loops, right? That's how birds with beaks that big came into existence. The second kind is stabilizing selection. What if being the middle one already was the best? Organisms in the middle of the curve are more fit, and this curve thins out. So the ones with, say, the smaller beaks in this situation were terrible. They couldn't eat the food and died out. The ones with the big beaks, say for whatever reason, such an oversized beak, they couldn't get a grip on the nut and they couldn't open the shells. So they started dying out. The medium ones then had no competition. So they had all the food, all the energy, all the reproduction, and it just keeps increasing. This will not result in a new species, but it is also going to result in less variation, and that's very dangerous. This seems like a good thing. Like, oh, good, we found the good one. Everyone join in, but it turns out it's bad because the environment changes all the time. What if the environment changes and there are no other varieties to keep up the species? Like, what if being medium suddenly sucks? There are no large-sized beak or small-sized beak to pick up the slack anymore. So now, if they're all the same, they all die. Variation is a good thing. Not having variation is a bad thing. But here's a real-life example of this happening. This is called sickle cell anemia. We've talked about this before. Sickle cell anemia is a blood disorder. Your red blood cells are supposed to be round. If you have sickle cell anemia, they're not. They're more crescent-shaped, like a crescent moon. And the problem with that is you carry less oxygen around your body, and sometimes they can get all caught up on each other and cause your blood vessels to rupture. It can become deadly. So here's how this is going to work. Remember last chapter with alleles, dominant and recessive. Turns out sickle cell anemia is a recessive trait. So the only way to have sickle cell anemia is if mom and dad both gave it to you. You have a sickle cell allele from mom and a sickle cell allele from dad, then you have sickle cell, and you will probably die of sickle cell anemia. Maybe not in America because we have good health care, but in Africa, they don't. And a lot of people with sickle cell in Africa die out. So we'll say that's these on this end. People with sickle cell are dying. And then if you don't have sickle cell, mom and dad both gave you healthy alleles, A for allele, I guess, then, well, it turns out you still die out because people in Africa are dying from malaria, mosquitoes biting you. And scientists found out the ones with sickle cell are not getting malaria. It turns out if you have sickle cell, you are malaria proof. Congratulations. So either you have sickle cell and you die from that, or you don't have sickle cell and you die from malaria. But then we got someone in the middle. We call them carriers. Mom gave a healthy allele, but dad gave a sickle cell allele. Healthy is dominant, so you don't have sickle cell, so you get to survive. The sickle cell won't kill you. But that recessive sickle cell still somehow makes you immune to malaria, so now you're also not dying from malaria. So the population in Africa is mostly carriers, which means sickle cell stays in the population. They keep passing it on, but and it's also why sickle cell anemia is more prevalent in the African American community than any other part of America. But it's a thing, like the population is increasing of that one trait. Then we got disruptive selection. This is one where, for whatever reason, I guess an environmental change, something happened where what used to be the best one is no longer the best one. Right? What used to be fit is no longer fit. Something weird happened. The organisms on the edges become the more fit ones. All right, the ones that you weren't too good are now great. Not too good, now great. Was great, not so good anymore. So now they're splitting down the middle. Here's an example. These are a certain kind of beetle, horned beetles. And the ones with the larger horns, females don't actually have horns in this species, right? But the ones with the large horns are more survivable because they need to fight for the right to breed. So the one with the larger horns typically win the fight, and they pass on their large horned allele. So you would see a lot of larger horns, and you should be seeing directional. Our first one where it starts moving toward the bigger one. But then this guy, this is still a male, it's not a female. This is a small horned variety, so small that you can't even see the horn, right? This guy should lose the fight every single time. He should die out. However, he learned a trick. This is the weird thing I said. This guy figured out, if I can't get through the big horned bully, I'm going to go around him. And he digs in, goes around, and without that big horn, this guy doesn't even notice he's there. He blends in, he looks like the female. So while this dude's over here standing guard, this guy is getting with all the ladies and passing on his little horned allele. So now we have the big horn passing on genes because they're all his girls, and this guy passing on the genes because he's surrounded by girls. Right? We got big horns and little horns. This poor medium-sized horn guy can't win the fight, and he can't get through the tunnel because his horn just makes him get stuck. So he can't pass on the alleles. So that's what we get. We get the medium-sized one decreasing and the small and the large increasing. Eventually, and then all this is what I just showed you in the picture, by the way, we don't have to read it. Eventually, this can go all the way down until we end up getting two different groups altogether. Eventually, those two groups could eventually become two different species. And they would just stop interacting altogether. All right, so that was all evolution. Now we have a few other things that also cause evolution to happen, but we're not going to spend too much time on them because they're not as prevalent. Natural selection is the big one, but we still have to talk about the others. So, genetic drift. A change in allele frequency due to chance events, meaning your traits have nothing to do with this. All right, you could be the most fit being in existence, but genetic drift, some one-time event that you weren't prepared for just suddenly happens. Not part of your normal environment, like an earthquake. You die in an earthquake, right? Your traits aren't going to be good enough to keep you alive through that. Or you die in a storm, you get struck by lightning. You know, a meteor lands on your house while you're sleeping, or it has nothing to do with how fit you are. That's genetic drift. So my examples here, I got a group of wolves. Red wolves and gray wolves are the same. In this case, I'm pretending they're the same species. They're actually not, but go with it. Right? And they are equally fit. No wolf is better than the other wolf. And then a lightning storm hits, and they get struck. And then suddenly, a bunch of red wolves died from the lightning. And looks like one of the gray wolves died too. But do you think being red made them conduct electricity better? No, had nothing to do with it. It was a chance event. It just happened to kill more red wolves than gray wolves. Had nothing to do with their traits. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's genetic drift. Now we have a gene pool that went from being pretty evenly spread to being mostly gray, even though gray is not the better trait. It just, they were in the right place at the right time. All right, next one, founder effect. A decrease in variation due to a few individuals starting a new population. For example, my rainbow caterpillars. The green ones say, you know what, screw you guys, I'm out. I'm starting my own new land over here, and they are going to breed with each other, and now they have a whole new population of just green. It's not because they were the better trait, it's because they are the only ones here. Here's a more human example. There's a town, and no one except redheads move in. Everyone's redhead. And the next generation then will also be redheads. Has nothing to do, you got a whole big redhead population. It's not because being redhead is better. In fact, they probably do a lot, they have probably a lot more trouble in the sun than everyone else. So it's not a better trait. It is, they're just the only ones there. That's what we call the founder's effect. They founded this land and they're the only ones there. And then over the course of generations, you start getting some more redheads because they're growing up and reproducing, and soon you get a whole town of them. And then migration, a change in the allele frequency due to movement of individuals in and out of that population, meaning they just leave or enter, or they come from other places. So here I have a population of these white geese, and suddenly these gray geese just move in and they start reproducing. And so you start getting, instead of a whole group of white geese, you have a group of white and gray geese. Right? It's not founder's effect because there was already an existing population. Founder's effect is when the place was empty. Right? The gray geese joined an existing group and they changed the population. If the gray geese all decide to leave, then they would change the population back. Right? Same thing with our land of redheads. If some blonde people decide they want to move in, now they're going to start reproducing, and you're going to start seeing more blonde offspring. Right. Eventually, all these changes is going to create what we call speciation, the formation of a brand new species. Right? They looked like one thing, now they're completely different. The exact moment that they are different, they are so genetically different that they cannot reproduce anymore. That's speciation. And that is going to come along from not reproducing with the old group anymore. So we need some way to prevent the new group from reproducing with the old group. And that's what we call isolating mechanisms. These are things that are going to help drive speciation. Things that are going to help natural selection along, or genetic drift, or whatever. Not genetic drift, but maybe migration, founder's effect. These are going to help evolution, because evolution is the long process leading up to speciation, really. So evolution, it's more like evolution is going to help speciation. But either way, we need isolating mechanisms, something that's going to prevent one group from reproducing with the other group so that they become two different groups, right? And we have a couple different things. One of them might be a behavioral difference. Maybe they don't reproduce because they don't act the same way. For instance, this bee wants to reproduce, the yellow bee wants to reproduce with the orange bee, which, by the way, side note, I know only the queen reproduces. I just felt like drawing bees, so go with it. Right? So the yellow bee wants to mate with the orange bee, and as we probably know, bees communicate by flight patterns. But what if the yellow bee and the orange bee don't speak the same language? Yellow bee is saying, hey, want to come over to my hive for the night? The orange bee has no idea what he just said. So, no, not going to go to the hive tonight. Or morphology, meaning the way you look. Quite frankly, the orange bee just thinks the yellow bee is ugly. Sad. Or genetics. Maybe they do reproduce, or at least they try to reproduce, but their genes just don't match up. Right? These are things that are going to prevent animals from reproducing, and that is what's going to drive speciation, the formation of brand new species. All right, that is where we are calling it quits today, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to come back later on and work on evolution and evidence of evolution. All right, until then, have a nice day.